Does RAM speed matter for gaming? Spend too little and you might find that your whole gaming PC starts stuttering, but then if you spend too much, then that's money you could have better spent on other components. So let's put this to bed once and for all. What is the different frames per second differences you'll get at different speeds, and ultimately what is going to be the right one to buy? Join us for what is definitely going to be a very memorable experience after a short word from this video's sponsor. I am killing it with the jokes this week. Want to get PC gaming without the hassle? Meet the Omen 25L, the desktop PC that packs some serious punch. With clean looks, serious performance and future upgradability, the Omen 25L is an all-out gaming beast. Get gaming today with the latest NVIDIA RTX graphics cards and unlock real-time ray tracing, DLSS upscaling, and latency-beating reflex tech. Reflex and DLSS are supported in games like Fortnite and Rust, with both features coming soon to Battlefield 2042. Learn more with that link down below. Let's waste absolutely no time and get stuck in. The main thing really that you need to know is that 16GB is probably going to be the sweet spot for you when it comes to RAM capacity. There are some performance differences, but nothing huge. If you want to find out more, you can find the video in the top right corner of your screen that explains this in greater detail. But of course today we're focusing in on the speed, and generally speaking you're typically looking at a kit between 3000 and 3600 MHz. If you're looking to pick up a really budget gaming PC, then granted used kits and certainly older kits will run at lower speeds, and if you want to go super high end you can get something like this, the 4600 MHz kit, but I reckon that most people are going to be choosing between 32 and 3600 MHz. Here we have our test system. We have a 10900K RTX 3080 Ti, and we are actually using this kit of RAM because we can set this to different frequencies. Just because it says it can reach 4600 MHz, as we saw from my last video, which again you can find in the top right corner of your screen, it doesn't actually mean that you're going to get this. So even if you spend a load of money on the fastest RAM you possibly can find, it doesn't actually mean it's going to work. One of the biggest mistakes that people make is not actually changing the speed of the RAM. And you do this in the BIOS, you just mash the delete key as your PC turns on for the first time. This is an MSI motherboard, so this is what the MSI BIOS looks like, but yours might look slightly different, I guess. But generally speaking, most people are going to want to enable this XMP memory profile. And the way that this works is pretty straightforward. As long as you're buying a kit that does actually support XMP, or Extreme Memory Profile, you will get a profile that's actually saved within the memory itself that can load in all of the timings to actually get this to run at its native, or at least its proper overclocked speed. Higher quality kits will typically support faster speeds, which is why they're more expensive, and you should definitely be aware that setting a faster memory speed than your CPU natively supports, this is actually going to be classed as overclocking, which doesn't really matter to be honest with you, but technically this could be breaking a warranty or two, so you should be aware of this, but it's not really a big problem in my eyes. If you build your PC with fast memory, but then you don't actually change any of the settings in the BIOS, you don't enable XMP or do this manually, then you're going to run into actually quite a big problem. And I think a lot of PC gamers watching this will actually have this exact issue, because your motherboard doesn't know what the fastest safe RAM speed is, so it usually is a little bit conservative and sets it to this, 2133. You're going to be running a system that is actually pretty slow and could cost you some serious gaming performance. So to show you exactly how much of an issue this is, or I suppose isn't, we are going to run some tests. We're going to do 4 different speeds. We'll start at 2133, we'll then go to 3200, then 3600, then the full whack 4600 MHz, and then we'll be able to answer whether RAM speed does actually make a difference. We're going to begin with the most scientific test, which is some Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I wouldn't say it's the most fun game in the world, but it is very scientific as the run is the same every time. With our 3080 Ti at 4K, we got 113 frames a second, but rather interestingly, you can see a potential issue already because the GPU boundness of this scenario is actually 75%, and I'd expect this to be 100 or at least very close at 4K. Let's be honest, if we're already at 75% GPU bound at 4K, then I think we're going to get some inferior results. What this means is that there's another bottleneck in our system. It probably will say it's the CPU, but do remember that the relationship between your processor and the RAM is actually very close, and even though you might think it's the speed of the processor, it could be limited by the RAM. Apex Legends is a pretty GPU-bound title. There haven't been many rigs I've built where we've actually experienced any issues at all, even at 1080p. We recently tested gaming CPUs, and the 11400F with a 3080 Ti actually performed the same across, I think it was all resolutions actually, it all capped out at the frame rate cap of 300. 150 at 4K, 226 at 1440p, and 270 at 1080p. Right, now let's really get this party started with, I think your favourite, some Call of Duty Warzone. I'm just not very good at it. I'm basically doing the bleep test. I run between two different blue barrels back and forth at different resolutions. It's really fascinating stuff, this. You should be aware though that I'm not actually running this with DLSS because you tend to get some weird results when you change the resolution mid-game. So if you're playing this for real, obviously do bear that one in mind. Which leaves us with one final game, the big one, Cyberpunk 2077. I'm actually thinking about playing it through again, but I seem to say that with most games. I think my biggest confession at the moment is that I still haven't finished Uncharted Lost Legacy, and I started playing that one years ago. But I did finish Control the other day, so I'm getting there. We go with the Ray Tracing Ultra preset, and we will set DLSS to quality. Once again, we're going to walk down the street in a straight line because it's fascinating stuff, but obviously it will get us those scientific numbers. I do believe that is all of the numbers in, which now means it's time to go back into the BIOS and actually set our RAM to a faster speed. Find where it says DRAM frequency, and then set this manually to 3200. Save and exit, and you might find at this stage that your PC doesn't actually boot. You get a DRAM error light on your motherboard, or it just sort of keeps boot cycling and nothing comes up on screen. If this does happen, don't worry, all you need to do is reset the CMOS because the values that you've entered just don't work properly. Shadow of the Tomb Raider results are in, and this time we are now 84% GPU bound. So that is a massive difference just by going from 2133 to 3200 megahertz. Granted, it's not a huge difference to the average FPS. We've got 115, which is up from 113, but do remember that this is likely to reduce the chances of you having any horrible stutters in your game, and this is also at 4K, so when we move to the lower resolutions, I think the results are going to speak for themselves. Of all the games that I've tested, Warzone definitely is the one where I've noticed in the past that it is the most RAM dependent. It's interesting because it's not normally the component people actually think about when it comes to frames per second, but now that a lot of games are actually getting quite CPU limited, especially in titles when you're using a high-end GPU, then I think it's becoming more important than ever, really. Okay, I've just seen the numbers and it's very impressive. Honestly, I didn't see that coming. That is it, ladies and gentlemen. All of the results are now in. They are as fascinating as I predicted. I need to hand you over to someone a lot more experienced than me, Bench Marcus. That's right, everybody, I am back to give you the hard numbers. And if you look at the 4K results, there's not really that much to go on, to be honest with you. Yes, if you look very closely at the Warzone figures, I think there is a subtle difference, but ultimately nothing that I think any of you would actually feel in real life gameplay. Moving on to 1440p, and it is a little bit more hit and miss. Apex Legends, exactly the same with the gaming CPUs. You don't really see any difference at all across all resolutions. But in both of our CPU limited titles, so Warzone and Shadow of the Tomb Raider, you can see a fair old difference across the stack. Yes, there's not really a huge difference with 4600, but 2133, 3200 and 3600 I would say all have significant differences that are beyond the usual margin of error. And this only gets exaggerated further when you look at 1080p. Again, not all games you're going to see a difference, but the more CPU limited you get with both Shadow of the Tomb Raider and in particular Warzone, the bigger differences you're going to see. For the money, 4600 MHz RAM is definitely not worth buying unless you've got a very specific scenario, because not all games are going to see a difference, and even when you do, you're only talking a couple of FPS for quite literally 100 to 200 pounds more, whereas the difference between 32 and 3600, I really do think that's worth the asking price. So there you go then, what do you make of those results? I did honestly think we were going to see a bigger difference at 4600. Bear in mind that this is the 11900K. This is a very up-to-date CPU, but even this is still limited really in certain games. I think the most surprising thing for me was just how much of a difference we saw between 32 and 3600 megahertz. So when you're doing your shopping and it's an extra what, $10, $15, it does go to show you that if you can afford that difference, it is quite literally going to translate into extra performance. However, do bear in mind that this is with an RTX 3080 Ti, and if you're not using that card, you're not going to see such a dramatic difference. And if you are playing at higher resolutions like 4K especially, but even 1440p, if you're using something like a RTX 3060, then you're probably not going to see any differences at all. Go ahead and absolutely smash the like button if you've enjoyed this video. It honestly helps out. Get yourself subscribed if you do want to see all of the parts that I actually used in this PC. You can find those linked down below. But do let me know your thoughts on this. Did you realise that RAM could make so much of a big difference? We would absolutely love to hear from you, so start the conversation down below, get yourself involved, and I'll see you in the next one.